Thank you. So, about 15 years ago, I decided I wanted to learn Spanish. And so after work, I took Spanish 1 in the fall semester, Spanish 2 in the spring semester, and people said, unless you do an immersion experience, you're not really gonna learn it very well. And so I did. I signed up for classes in Mexico that would be taught by Spanish speakers, and I would live with a family that does not speak English. And it was wonderful. And the family became so dear to me, even though my communication was poor at best. And the mother and I became very close, and we would try to have these deeper conversations, and she said, in Spanish, "Are you religious?" And I took a deep breath, and constructing the words in my brain, I said, "No soy religiosa, pero estoy en un viaje espiritual. Estoy cómoda con las preguntas y no necesito las respuestas. I'm not religious, but I'm on a spiritual journey. I'm comfortable with questions, and I don't need answers." She looked at me curiously, and you could tell she wanted to know more, but how the heck was I going to explain all of that in my limited Spanish? Since very young, I had a sense of mystery. I was very open and flexible, and I loved change and new. And it was a lovely way to be in the world. But when I went to middle school, which was 3 years when I was in school, it was a little difficult to navigate. I was drawn to students who had economic challenges, dysfunctional families, involving themselves in illegal activities, and unfortunately, not knowing how to navigate that, I joined them. And that's kind of what we do at that age. But my parents sort of panicked, and they decided I would go to a different high school. And I was relieved at that. I was quite relieved. I could be free again and away from those temptations, but I didn't feel like I necessarily had a foundation that would keep me on task. I was drawn to this kind of odd group of young people who were kind of all over the place, and the boys had long hair and they wore funky clothes, and they were what we would have called then Jesus freaks. They were so energetic and lively, and I wanted in. There were definitely mores and taboos, there were rules, there was the Bible, but there was room for dialogue, and I was good. And it certainly kept me out of trouble. So, then moving on to college, of course I'm going to look for a community like that, and I was invited to a Campus Crusade for Christ Bible study. And a young woman was leading it, and we had a set format and everything neat and tidy, and I started my normal way of being. It wasn't challenging, it wasn't argumentative, but it was questioning and exploring options, and she cried. She did not know what to do with this, and she didn't feel she had the answers. They should be right here, but she didn't have them. I think she had to get counseling from her leadership. Oh well. I was judged because I sought knowledge and understanding, not certainty. In this world, I was to distribute 4 spiritual laws, submit to men, listen to preachers who told me what the Bible says and how it should be interpreted with no discussion, and I just wasn't comfortable with that kind of certainty. But I didn't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. I took classes at my secular university in Old Testament and New Testament, comparative religions, and I began to see that that stuff that they were delivering didn't need to be followed. Knowledge and questioning and experiencing and enlightened and deepened me, and found places, and I found places and people who wanted the same thing. In grad school, I moved away from friends and my previous social groups, and I was looking for a church. I wanted to be a part, but I needed a special place, and it was not easy. After many attempts, I found the United Church of Christ, and there was a hodgepodge there. There were lots of young people, there were atheists, there were agnostics. Everybody felt very comfortable with being who they were in that environment. And so that fit for me. That was a good fit. But over the years, identifying myself as a Christian just didn't work anymore. I didn't feel I could ascribe to one way of thinking, and I couldn't use the language of that anymore. And I left the church. It was after quite a long time. Though taking a 15-year break from church, my desire continued for a community of seekers who were comfortable with the questions, who sought knowledge and were committed to the struggle. And the UU has become that for me. And here I am. No soy religiosa, pero estoy en un viaje espiritual. Estoy cómoda con las preguntas y no necesito respuestas.
So I introduced myself earlier, but I'll do it again. I'm Linda Tolliday. I joined this church 15 years ago now. That can't be true. Thank you. I started off getting involved in the worship arts team, and then went on to doing some rounds of church leadership. I served as president of the board of trustees for a while, heavens, and then co-chaired the search committee, which brought us Reverend Tim. That's still the thing I'm proudest of in the church. And I'm back now serving on, and I have for the past few years, as chair of our worship arts team, which is where my heart lies in church community. Today, I want to talk a little bit about the concepts of knowledge and certainty. So a few days ago, I was being lazy, indulging in one of my favorite pastimes, arguing on the internet. And what was I arguing about? I was arguing that modern feminism was not trying to remove the choice for a woman to decide she wished to fulfill traditional gender roles for women. The guy I was arguing with insisted that since modern feminism wishes to eliminate gender-based roles, it was in fact eliminating the choice of a woman who wished to fulfill traditional female gender roles because they would not, okay, this doesn't matter, it's really not germane. The argument was esoteric at best, at worst it was trivial. I was so sure I was right, as was my opponent, that we failed to pay attention to the fact that we were just indulging in an exercise of futility, and we went on at each other as if the argument was what mattered. I had once again fallen into the trap of thinking that being right was important. I do that far more than I'd like to admit. I bet I'm not alone. And here's the deal. I'm wrong about stuff. You're wrong about stuff. We're all wrong about stuff. That's just math. Given the number of things that all of us believe or do not believe to be true, the number of things we consider or do not consider valuable, the number of policies we believe or do not believe will work, there's no possible way to be right about everything. We understand this retroactively. We can all remember times we were wrong in the past, but such is the nature of human cognition that we can barely even fathom that we might be wrong right now. Robert Burton, the former chief of neurology at the University of California in San Francisco, Mount Zion, recently wrote a book on being certain that explored the neuroscience behind feeling that you are right. He says there are two separate aspects of a thought: the actual thought and an independent involuntary assessment of the accuracy of that thought. Once we realize that the brain has a very powerful inbuilt involuntary mechanism for assessing cognitive ability, it's easy to see how it can send into consciousness a message that we know something. We can't presently recall that modest tip of the tongue feeling, right? At the other end of the spectrum would be the profound feeling of knowing that accompanies unconsciously held beliefs, a major component of the unshakable attachment to fundamentalist beliefs, both religious and otherwise. It turns out human reason did not evolve to help us find the truth. It evolved to help us defend positions largely arrived at largely in unreasonable ways. The reason for this lies deep in the reptilian corners of our brain. Natural selection selects for what is useful. Appearing confident, useful. Decisiveness, useful. Defending one's turf, useful. And winning fights, always useful. But knowing the truth about abstract universal propositions involving beauty, truth, and God, not so much. It turns out that appearing to know the truth about these things is more valuable, evolutionarily speaking, than actually being right. Many of us have heard that if you stick brain electrodes into the pleasure centers of rats, they'll continuously push the button until they drop. It's quite likely the same or a similar reward system exists to provide the positive feedback necessary for us to learn and continue to want to learn. The pleasure of a thought is what propels us forward. Imagine trying to write a novel, compose a piece of music, create a piece of art, learn a language, or engage in a long-term scientific experiment without getting such rewards. Fortunately, the brain provides us with a wide variety of subjective feelings of reward, ranging from hunches, gut feelings, intuitions, suspicions we're on the right track, to a profound sense of certainty and utter conviction. And yes, these are probably qualitatively as powerful as those feelings involved in sex and gambling. One need only to look at the self-satisfied smugness of a know-it-all to suspect that all feelings of certainty can approach the power of addiction. I take strong exception to the popular notion we can rely upon hunches and gut feelings as though they reflect the accuracy of thought. My hope is the converse. We need to recognize that the feelings of certainty and conviction are involuntary mental sensations, not logical conclusions. Intuitions, gut feelings, and hunches are neither right nor wrong, but tentative ideas that must be then submitted to empirical testing. If such testing isn't possible, we must accept that any absolute stance is a personal vision, not a statement of fact. The late physicist Carl Sagan put it this way: I try not to think with my gut. If I'm serious about understanding the world, thinking with anything besides my brain, as tempting as it might be, is likely to get me into trouble. And yet we go off again and again and again, blundering along with all of our evolutionary certainty intact. This isn't a conservative problem or a liberal problem. I suggest it's a human problem. I don't believe we can avoid certainty bias, but perhaps we can mitigate its effect by becoming aware of how our mind assesses itself. And once we realize that the mind of everyone else does this about as poorly as our own minds do, perhaps in paying very strong attention to whatever is being advocated from a position of certainty and not a position of knowledge. In short, please run, do not walk. Anytime you hear so-called leaders of any group, be certain about what they are advocating. Run even faster if they can produce no actual evidence to support their beliefs. If we wish for open-mindedness and the mental flexibility and willingness to contemplate alternative ideas, we're going to have to do something about our certainty. For some folks, the opposite of certainty is skepticism, unquestioning questioning of everything. Bill Maher advocates this approach, though seeming without employing it himself most of the time. While I believe skepticism is really important, I think it too can be taken to extremes. Carl Sagan again, if you're only skeptical, then no new ideas make it through to you. You never learn anything. You become a crotchety misanthrope convinced that nonsense is ruling the world. There is, of course, much data to support you on this idea. Since major discoveries are rare, experience will tend to confirm your grumpiness. But every now and then, a new idea turns out to be on the mark, valid, and wonderful. If you're too resolutely and uncompromisingly skeptical, you're going to miss the transforming discoveries. And either you're going to be obstructing understanding and progress. Mere skepticism is not enough. Okay, so what is the solution? True confession, I'm a science teacher. I'm going to suggest perhaps it lies in science. Science is not a major or a career. It's a commitment to a systematic way of thinking, an allegiance to a way of building knowledge and explaining the universe through testing and factual observation. The thing is, it isn't a normal way of thinking. It's unnatural and counterintuitive much of the time. It has to be learned. Scientific explanation stands in contrast to the wisdom of divinity and experience and common sense. Common sense once told us the sun moves across the sky, and if you go out in the winter, you're going to catch cold. It took scientific minds to recognize these intuitions were hypotheses that had to be tested. When I started college, I took a class called Man and the Natural Environment, a class that combined geology, biology, and anthropology with long periods of field work. The most intellectually unnerving thing I discovered was how wrong many of my assumptions about the world were. I looked to my professors and fellow students to supply replacement ideas for my original thinking. And then I returned home with some of those ideas and told my parents everything they'd got wrong. They loved that. But even then, I was just replacing one set of received beliefs for another. It took me a long time to recognize the particular mindset that scientists have. The great physicist Edwin Hubble, speaking at Caltech's commencement in 1938, said a scientist, quote, has a healthy skepticism, suspended judgment, and disciplined imagination, not only about other people's ideas, but also about his or her own. The scientist has an experimental mind, not a litigious one. As a student, this seemed to me much more than a way of thinking. It was a way of being, kind of weird way of being. You're supposed to have skepticism and imagination, but not too much. You're supposed to suspend judgment, yet exercise it. Ultimately, you hope to observe the world with an open mind, gathering facts and testing your predictions and expectations against them. Then you make decisions to either affirm or reject the ideas at hand. But you also hope to accept that nothing is ever completely settled. All knowledge is probable knowledge. Hubble again, the scientist explains the world by successive approximations. And here's something that matters. Scientists don't do this alone. Few working scientists can give a ground-up explanation of the phenomenon they study. They rely on information and techniques borrowed from other scientists. Knowledge and the virtues of the scientific orientation lie far more in the community than the individual. When we talk of a scientific community, we're pointing to something critical, that advanced science is a social enterprise characterized by an intricate division of cognitive labor. Individual scientists, no less than the quacks, can be famously bullheaded, overly enamored of their own pet theories, dismissive of new evidence, and heedless of their own fallibility. The physicist Max Planck once observed that science advances one funeral at a time. But as a community endeavor, science is beautifully self-correcting. Okay, Hugh, we have a solution to being certain. We can rely on science, except, of course, it isn't that simple either. Science is impartial and impersonal. It simply is. What we make of science, that can be used for good or twisted into evil. I took the title for this sermon from a long ago episode of a public television show called The Ascent of Man. The writer and narrator, the mathematician Jacob Bronowski, the series described in Bronowski's delightfully underplayed way the history of humanity's scientific endeavors. The first 10 episodes are charming forays into the development of various scientific ways of looking at the world, and then there comes the 11th episode, Knowledge or Certainty, in which the tone changed dramatically. Bronowski began the episode with the words, "One aim of the physical sciences has been to give an actual picture of the material world. One achievement of physics in the 20th century has been to show that such an aim is unattainable. What physics has now done is to show there is no absolute knowledge, and those who claim it, whether they are scientists or dogmatists, open the door to tragedy. All information is imperfect. We have to treat it with humility. That is the human condition, and that's what quantum physics says. Errors are inexorably bound up with the pursuit of knowledge, which requires not just mathematical calculation, but insight, interpretation, and a personal act of judgment for which we are responsible." The emphasis on moral responsibility of knowledge was essential for all of Dr. Bronowski's work. The acquisition of knowledge entails a responsibility for the integrity of what we are as ethical creatures. I want to play for you the end of this episode, the last couple of minutes, Knowledge or Certainty. Cross your fingers.
It's said that science will dehumanize people and turn them into numbers. That's false, tragically false. Look for yourself. This is the concentration camp and crematorium at Auschwitz. This is where people were turned into numbers. Into this pond were flushed the ashes of some 4 million people. And that was not done by gas. It was done by arrogance. It was done by dogma. It was done by ignorance. When people believe that they have absolute knowledge with no test in reality, this is how they behave. This is what men do when they aspire to the knowledge of gods. Science is a very human form of knowledge. We are always at the brink of the known. We always feel forward for what is to be hoped. Every judgment in science stands on the edge of error and is personal. Science is a tribute to what we can know, although we are fallible. In the end, the words were said by Oliver Cromwell. I beseech you in the bowels of Christ, think it possible you may be mistaken. I owe it as a scientist to my friend Leo Szilard. I owe it as a human being to the many members of my family who died here, to stand here as a survivor and a witness. We have to cure ourselves of the itch for absolute knowledge and power. We have to close the distance between the push-button order and the human act. We have to touch people.
We have to touch people. Isn't this exactly what our faith calls us to do? Unitarian Universalists agree to affirm and promote 7 principles, the first of which is to affirm and promote the inherent worth and dignity of every person. It turns out that certainty isn't enough, and knowledge isn't enough, and skepticism isn't enough, and science isn't enough. Our faith asks more of us and gives us more. The sources from which Unitarian Universalism draws its wisdom include humanist teachings which counsel us to heed the guidance of reason and the results of science, and warn us against idolatries of the mind and spirit. Idolatries of the mind and spirit. Claiming knowledge and reason without accepting personal responsibility for what we know seems to me to be very much where we are when we are certain, relying on our fallible, pleasure center reptilian brain, walking us blindly right into idolatry of the mind. When we make reason an idol, we take something very valuable to our religion and mistake it for the foundation of our religion. In the end, I propose that it matters that I keep remembering, you keep remembering, we all keep remembering. We know less than we think we know. We are certain about far more than we have any reason to be certain, and that keeping our minds open enough to allow the space to be wrong just might allow us the space to be humans who stand as more than the sum of their biology. Humans willing to do the hard work of living into what our faith calls us to do. May it be so. Blessed be. Amen.